So it's very nice to see so many enthusiastic and educated people here, and I imagine Philip Larkin himself, what he would say to us, to this assembly here. Probably he would smile at what we are doing here. We are celebrating the beginning of a career that was cut in half, that of Larkin the novelist. As we all know, Larkin wanted to become a novelist in the mid-40s and became a major poet only later. Nevertheless, it is a pleasure to reread Jill and a Girl in Winter. Reading always means discovery, visiting realms of gold, as Keats so beautifully wrote. Rereading means discovering something new in places that we visited before. Most of us, I believe, we read the early novels through Larkin's later poetry, but with any luck, we can discover some meanings in them that were hidden from us before. Now, can I work with it? Yes, it works. In a frequently quoted interview that has already been quoted today, Larkin said, a very crude distinction between novels and poetry is that novels are about other people and poetry is about yourself. It has been quoted today, and in the same interview he also claimed, I wouldn't want to write a poem which suggested that I was different from what I am. And what about the novels, we might ask? How is he related to the protagonists, John Kemp and Catherine? Shall we simply accept his suggestion that the novels are about the lives of other people rather than his own life? My suggestion is that it is more complicated. I will argue that both characters can be read as Larkin's masks. But what is a mask in literature? First of all, the mask is not to hide the writer, just the opposite is true. When Larkin said he admired T.S. Eliot's Murder in the Cathedral, he referred to a text in which the hero was constructed as the author's mask. And Eliot insisted that the mask made it possible for him to communicate with the reader. His first major poem is not the love song of T.S. Eliot. It is the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock. But Prufrock is Eliot's mask. So is Tiresias in The Waste Land, and so is Thomas Becket in Murder in the Cathedral. When a poet or a prose writer puts on a mask, she assumes the role of a character created by the author, while also emphasizing that she's playing a role. Reading it is a bit like watching a performance in theater. We are aware that the actor is playing a role, but we accept that role playing. The mask is always a representation of the relationship between the author and the hero, and it can be seen as a part of the author's construction of their own identity. The narrator of Jill sees and judges the central hero or anti-hero John Kemp with detachment. As Jean Hartley remarked, Larkin needed, I feel, to be able to distance himself from others and from his participating self, to become the outsider, objectively observing his own motives and the life going on around him. This is the attitude Larkin made use of when writing the novel. He insisted that John Kemp was not a self-portrait, but also admitted that he projected his own embarrassment into the extremely inhabited behavior of John Kemp. To use Eliot's term, Kemp's awkward character is an objective correlative of Larkin's stammer. Kemp is not a self-portrait. His figure is a mask into which the author projected something of his own identity. The relationship between Larkin and Kemp can be seen both in terms of similarity and contrast. Jill is not a realist novel in the 19th century sense of the term, since it doesn't explore the reasons of Kemp's extremely passive and inhibited behavior. You know, when we read the novel, we keep on asking ourselves, why? Why does he behave like that? I mean, I persuaded my wife to read it, and as she was reading it, she kept on asking this question, why? But you know, that is the reason that we ask when we read Wuthering Heights. I mean, why does Heathcliff behave like that? But that is an exception in the 19th century, because in most cases, the author also explores the reasons and informs us about the reasons. So we don't have any particular information about Kemp's extremely passive and inhibited behavior. What still makes it a good read is the representation of how Kemp constructs his own dream world and how he puts it into writing. In other words, and we should keep that in mind, Kemp is a writer. Consequently, it is not only his stammer that Larkin projected into his figure, but also the difficulties he struggled with at the beginning of his career as a writer. The humiliation of the central character at the end of the novel signifies the failure of a potential writer. How does John Kemp invent the figure of Jill? I know that most of you will know every nook and corner of the novel of Jill, but let us recall, how does he invent the figure of Jill? He does so on the spur of the moment. After overhearing Chris's and Elizabeth's derogatory remarks, he is first angry, but instead of talking to Chris about it, he suddenly starts speaking about this imaginary sister. A part of the irony is that John does have a sister who is much older than himself and works as a teacher. But this part of his own biography wouldn't serve his purpose. Instead of the teacher who represents the past, sorry colleagues, I mean those who are teachers here, we inevitably represent the past, no help. A young student, on the other hand, represents the future. Instead of the dullness of a monotonous job, she represents the excitement of rebellion and endless possibilities. Obviously, through the figure of Jill, John wants to make himself more interesting and more attractive. However, it doesn't work. This way, Larkin offers a brilliant and bitter parody of the therapeutic function of literature. Well, just ask any writer, or you don't even need to be a writer sometimes. Psychologists, psychiatrists give you this advice: write it out of yourself. If you suffered a trauma, write it out of yourself. Or think of the early 19th century major romantic poet Shelley, who in defense of poetry wrote about pain converted into pleasure through literature. In his early critical study of Larkin, Andrew Motion suggests Jill is a novel about writing, about discovering a literary personality, and about the source of consolation that art can provide. Yes, consolation, I would add, but this is consolation that never comes. Actually, David Hoxett was talking about that in the morning. Larkin's first novel offers a caricature of our general notions of literature. He makes it sure that we cannot identify with John, although we regret him. We have learned that the meaning of a literary text is always determined by the writer and the reader. In other words, a novel or a poem is always written by somebody to somebody, by an author to a potential reader. John Kemp starts writing fictitious letters and posts them to a fictitious address. This is what happens after he posts the first of these letters. He was trembling when he dropped it into a pillar box and leant against the wall a moment, filled with exultation at the idea of thus speaking with nothingness. John Kemp is Larkin's mask in the sense that this figure is his antithesis. His notion of writing goes against Larkin's ideal of literature as preservation for the sake of his readers. I'm not quoting the famous passage, everybody will remember his passage about the importance of preservation in literature, and that is something that is impossible for John Kemp. Whereas writing is the central notion in Jill, the second novel, A Girl in Winter, has a focus on reading as a metaphor. Reading text and reading other people is a basic tendency in Catherine. She's a mask in the sense that she represents what Larkin wants to become. Both novels are self-reflexive and show the two basic events of literature. Jill represents writing and A Girl in Winter, reading. I agree with Mark Rau's emphasis. He writes not about girls, but about writing about girls. In Jill, Larkin showed a failed attempt. In the second novel, he also shows how to do it. Catherine represents some of Larkin's own ideas and principles. When in an interior monologue, she thinks that one is, where she thinks that one is not moved by even a poem in a foreign language. That echoes Larkin's words in an interview. I don't see how one can know a foreign language well enough to make reading poems in it worthwhile. So, the striking similarity of the two quotations shows that Catherine is really Larkin's alter ego, a representation of his own ideas. Catherine's notion of place and time is such a direct representation of Larkin's own ideas that it anticipates a short poem in the Whitsun Weddings. These are, and I will go there, these are Catherine's thoughts in Larkin's free indirect speech when she reflects on her flat in Britain. Like all other places, it was both temporal and eternal, and she found that degrees of temporality didn't interest her, while in eternity, of course, there were no such measurements. The speaker of days seems to be much more simple-minded, but his naive questions make him realize the same contrast between temporality and eternity. This figure is a person trapped in the daily routine of human life. You will know the poem, of course. What are days for? Days are where we live. They come, they wake us time and time over. They are to be happy in. Where can we live but days? Just in brackets, probably it can also be read as a parody of the 19th century American poet Emerson's poem with the same title. The questions in this stanza are childish, but they focus on a basic problem of philosophy, the meaning of time. In our everyday existence, we experience three essential features of time: infinity, continuity, and dividability. The speaker in the first stanza sees the division of time into days as something natural. The essence of the question in the last line is this: could this be otherwise? Where can we live but days? But the unexpected reply in the second stanza shows a completely different character. If we read the novel and the poem together, we can imagine Catherine as the speaker of the second stanza. Solving that question. This is the famous that a few of us discussed in emails before the conference, how Larkin uses the sudden realization, solving that question brings the priest and the doctor in their long coats running over the fields. And you know, there is a huge gap here, and you will give the meaning as a reader. The first stanza represents the splitting up of time into units like days. The second represents the eternity that Catherine thinks of. And that is one of the basic questions of philosophy. How is it possible that time is continuous and still you can split it up into units? How can the two features of time be reconciled? Ancient Greek philosophers were unable to solve the question. We are unable to solve that question, but it can be represented, such as in this poem by Larkin. Catherine works in a library, and this is significant not only because of Larkin's biography, but also because books signify reading. Catherine is a reader of books, of letters, and other people. In her personal contacts, she always wants to look behind the masks of other people. If you read the novel, you will remember that she's definitely reading other people. She wants to look behind the mask. And that is particularly important because she comes from a different country, which is never revealed. We don't know which the country is. But she wants to understand English people here, look behind their masks. And this is how the circle I've been talking about becomes full. Larkin constructed masks to enable himself to see behind them. In my reading, this is the very meaningful paradox that makes the two novels fun to read and reread. Thank you.